Castlevania, a legendary series which for the most part has been on the shelf for a long time now. Over the recent years though, there has been some new interest in it with the release of the animated series, which was very popular with a lot of people now eager for a new game in the series. Now I don't have any news on a new game, but here on this channel I like to go back and revisit the old classics. With the delay of my video on Castlevania games for the Game Boy, I thought I'd release the videos I've done on Castlevania games for the NES in one package to keep the hype train rolling for my follow-up video and potentially gather some extra traction for it. So here it is, Castlevania games on the NES. I hope you enjoy. I should probably start by saying my first introduction to the Castlevania series was the fourth entry in the series, that came out in 1991 for the Super Nintendo, named Super Castlevania 4, and I absolutely loved it. You see, I was born in 1993, so of course I didn't get to enjoy it on release, but some of my earliest gaming related memories was watching my parents play this along with the other games they had bought throughout the years for the system. It wouldn't be until years later when, to be honest, I was getting pretty bored of the modern games that were coming out at the time and decided to hook up the Super Nintendo to see if I could finally beat some games I never did when I was younger. The first game to be placed in the Super Nintendo was Super Castlevania 4. I suddenly felt an overwhelming sensation that I would later find out was called nostalgia, and I was absolutely hooked. The gameplay, the graphics, the enemies, the sub-weapons, and holy moly, the music. I was instantly hooked. Then it got me thinking, if this is the fourth game in the series, then what are the previous three like? I didn't know about the Game Boy versions at this point. I just knew there was 3 previous titles I needed to track down, and I finally did. So let's talk about the first in the series, Castlevania. The game was directed by a man named Hitoshi Akamatsu, I think that's how you say it anyway, who to this day is surrounded in mystery. For someone who made this series, he kind of just disappeared after the release of the third game, Dracula's Curse, and I assume he liked his privacy, because there isn't much information about him on the internet. What I could find though is he was a massive fan of old school horror films and cinema in general, and wanted to make a game that put the player into a film-like game, which when we get into the game, you'll notice it. The game was originally released in 1986 for the Family Computer Disk System, being published and developed by Konami. There was many ports of this game released over the years, and for the most part they are all the same apart from the MSX version that went under the name of Vampire Killer. But there are many added features and the gameplay is a bit different, which I'll touch on later. But in this video we'll cover probably the most well known and played version, that being the version on the Nintendo Entertainment System released in 1987. As far as the story goes, well, they didn't do it justice from reading the back of the box, that's for sure. Remember, this was way before the internet, and plus it's the first game in the series. I don't think they had expectations of it becoming a well-loved series. Knowing what we all know now about Castlevania, you can imagine my face when I finally found this game boxed at an old retro store. Yeah, the front cover looked on point, and just what I was expecting, but when I flipped it over and read the following, it just left me puzzled. If you think it's scary on the outside, wait till you see the basement. You're in for the longest night of your life. Ghosts, goblins, demons, wolves, bats, creatures lurking around every corner. As you descend deeper and deeper, they get thicker and thicker. Okay. Better stick close to the cavern floor, it's your only chance of finding a weapon or two. You're gonna need them. Because when you finally meet the Count, you know he'll be going for the jugular. So keep your courage up and your stakes sharp, and say your prayers. I mean, what the hell is that? It doesn't do it justice for what's truly lurking in and around said castle. I mean, I had only played the fourth game by this point, and I knew that what I was reading was a load of bollocks. My only theory for this is maybe they decided to tone it down so when kids handed it to their parents to buy and they looked on the backside to read it, it didn't come across too scary for them. I don't know, but I'll tell you what the back of the box should have said. After Dracula was destroyed by the legendary Christopher Belmont, Transylvania had been enjoying peace for the last 100 years. The locals were enjoying their Easter celebration when out of nowhere a bolt of lightning struck. During the panic, Dracula's castle rose from the ground where it was once demolished, signalling the return of the Count himself. Simon Belmont, a member of the Belmont clan, knew it was only him who could save Transylvania by using the same whip, the Vampire Killer, which brought an end to Dracula's terrifying reign a century earlier. I mean, how badass does that sound? But enough talking about the plot, let's get into the game. The game starts with Simon Belmont walking up to the gates of Dracula's castle and the game begins. The aim is to get from point A to point B. It's very linear. The game is cut up into 18 stages. You'll know when you have reached a new stage. This occurs by entering a door, or when you beat a boss you'll see Simon walking with a map in the background indicating where you're going next. Or you could just look at the stage counter in the top right hand side of the screen. With the NES only having an A and B button, it's fairly straightforward controlling Simon. You control his movement with the D-pad, the A button is used for jumping, and by pressing B you can use his whip, the vampire killer. There are many sub-weapons that can be picked up along the way, and to use these you must press up on the D-pad while pressing B. Sounds annoying, but it actually works pretty well if I'm honest. Among these stages you'll encounter many different enemy types that suit the setting of the game very well. You'll come across zombies, bats, fishmen, skeletons, along with many more. They all have their own unique characteristics. I don't feel like any two enemies are the same. You've got some that will just come towards you that are easy to take out, while others may throw projectiles or come towards you in a pattern like Medusa heads that are fairly easy to defend, but when more than one appear it can become pretty chaotic. This one section in stage 15 really got on my nerves. You have to face axe throwing men who take a ton of hits and can block your sub weapons while Medusa heads are flying all around you. Each enemy you defeat you will be granted with points, which is something I've never got. Like, I understand around this time there was a big boom surrounding arcade machines, which was all top score heavy, but who was bragging back then about getting X amount of points on a home console in a game like this? With the amount of enemies thrown at you, the game does well by including a large number of sub-weapons to collect. You can only hold one sub-weapon at a time, so it can be trial and error to see which one suits you best for each level. The good thing about the sub-weapons in this is that they all have their own uniqueness to them, like the knife. Oh wait, the dagger? Or how about the holy cross? Wait, the boomerang? Let's talk about the holy water then. Firebomb? What's with all these names for sub-weapons? It's almost like a sort of Mandela effect. We've been naming these wrong our whole lives when it's always been there in black and white right in front of our eyes. Anyway, from here I'll be calling them by the names I know them as. The knife is thrown straight ahead. The axe is thrown in an arch, which is good for hitting enemies that may be above you. Holy water will stop enemies in their tracks and completely decimate them. But my two personal favourite sub-weapons have to go to the holy cross and the stopwatch. The holy cross will hit an enemy as it flies past them, and also hit them on the way back to you, dealing 2 amounts of damage. The stopwatch does just that, stops time completely, which can be good for stopping tougher enemies to lay into them with the whip, or even stop obstacles in your path, making it easier to get past. Some of these sub-weapons can make enemy bosses a walk in the park though, like check me out against the Queen Medusa. Just stop the time and smack her up with a whip. Complete joke. You can also get upgrades for your sub-weapons by collecting these books with numbers on them. The highest they go up to is free. By collecting these you have the ability to throw multiple sub-weapons at once, dealing even more damage. These can be found in places within the levels, or if you successfully kill enemies 10 times with said sub-weapons, you'll be granted with these upgrades. You may have seen from the footage me picking up hearts along my way. I wouldn't laugh at you if you thought they were for regenerating your health, because they aren't. They are actually used for your sub-weapons. Depending on the sub-weapon, they take up certain amount of hearts. For example, the knife takes up 1, while something like the stopwatch takes up 5. You may be wondering how exactly you regain health, and that is by whipping walls to find hidden bits of meat. No joke. These can also be found in stones that blend in within the scenery, so if you're about to die, it may be worthwhile just whipping at everything to see what's hidden. There are also upgrades for the whip. You start with a weaker whip, but by picking up these upgrades they make it made of steel, then the second upgrade makes it longer for better range against the enemies. There's also an invincibility upgrade you can get, but this only lasts for a brief period of time. And also a cross which obliterates everything on screen, but I always seem to find them when there was no enemies around, making it pretty pointless most of the time. The earlier Castlevania games get heavily criticised for their difficulty, and it's not so much that I find them hard. They can be a little frustrating at times though. This can all be pointed towards the dreaded knockback when Simon gets hit. He will fall backwards and become invincible for a brief period. That's all fine and well, but if you're on a ledge and get knocked back, that's an instant death. Also, while on stairs you are completely vulnerable to attacks. You can whip while on the stairs, but given how slow Simon controls, it's usually hard to get yourself in an optimal position to attack unless the enemy is directly in your line of attack. Not so bad at the start of the game, but this can become challenging towards the end. Stage 17, I'm talking to you. But really, who wants to play a game that's incredibly easy? What's to gain from that? If Castlevania did not have these issues, it would be a walk in the park. From other videos I have seen on this game, I really think they are playing up for the camera. Yeah, it's for entertainment purposes, I get that, but I've met loads of people who refuse to play these earlier Castlevania games because they assume the whole game is just one big death trap, when it's not. The game gives you ample amounts of upgrades to be able to give yourself a decent challenge. Also, when you die, it's not like you get sent back to the beginning of the game, you just get placed in the stage after the last boss you defeated, so it's pretty fair with you if we're honest here. Now I know this sounds like I'm giving it the big one, thinking I'm the bollocks at this game. I'm definitely not. My first ever playthrough did give me a good challenge, but this is now my third or so playthrough, so with experience of course you're going to find it a little less forgiving. One thing I found the most challenging were actually the bosses. There are 6 in total and none of them are the same. Taking further inspiration from classic horror films, we see the likes of a vampire bat, Queen Medusa, Frankenstein and Igor, Death, Mummy Man and Dracula himself. They all come with their own challenges. The Mummy, Queen Medusa and the Vampire Bat are fairly easy enough, but my god, Death, Frankenstein with Igor and Dracula are brutal. Death throws his scythes around, so you must either hit them or avoid them while also getting some hits on Death himself. Frankenstein is easy enough, but it's his snide pal Igor that'll give you the most bother by jumping all over the place. But the most annoying of all, and to be honest, every time I get to him it takes me ages to remember his pattern, and that is Dracula. The idea is straightforward enough. Land hits on the head, but he throws fire projectiles whenever he is vulnerable for attacks. Once you get the pattern down, you'll feel like an absolute idiot for not doing so earlier. Dracula has 2 forms. Once the initial form has been defeated, he turns into some big mad beast. Thankfully though, this form is easier than the previous one. Once defeated, you get to watch the castle crumble once again and the credits start to roll. It's pretty well known now that all the credits are puns on famous actors from the classic horror film world. A nice nod to the folk who inspired this game to begin with. The whole setting in which this game takes place is absolutely fantastic. No 2 levels ever feel the same. I can imagine if I played this as a kid, I'd have felt as scared as I did seeing Castlevania 4 for the first time. For me personally, the whole castle feels believable. Like, even though I was an adult when I first played this, I'll never forget seeing the top of the castle out in the distance while playing. Gave me that gut feeling that it was about to get real. Every environment you're in just feels alive, not only due to enemies lurking everywhere, but while in the clock tower you see the gears turning, which apparently represented Dracula's heart. As long as they keep turning, Dracula is still alive, which when watching the castle fall, it's only the clock tower you see falling while the rest still remains, subtly hinting at a sequel. Hitoshi's idea was to create a horror game inspired by his favourite films. He wanted you to feel like you were playing in a film, and it comes across that way. The credit screen looks like an old school credit scroll, and also look at the main menu. The pattern at the top and bottom look exactly like old film reels. We can't talk about a Castlevania game though without mentioning the music, and trust me, it's fantastic. Really helps keeping the pace of the game up and can be pretty spooky at times. It's definitely not my favourite Castlevania soundtrack of all time, but it does the job well. Some songs in this would later be remixed or reimagined for future titles. It's just refreshing to hear that they handled the music brilliantly from the start for this franchise. I did briefly touch on the other version of this game that was being worked on at the same time called Vampire Killer, which for the most part looks and plays the same, but there was a bit more exploration involved with the player having to get keys which are well hidden to progress through the stages. Personally, I haven't played that version, as I feel the NES version is the total package, but this maybe have been part of the experimentation that would lead to the follow-up game, Simon's Quest, which will be my next video, so stay tuned for that. That brings me to the end of this video. Please, if you haven't before, then definitely give this game a bash. It's now known as a classic, and for good reasons too. Whenever I think of Nintendo, I of course think of Mario and Zelda, but coming in at a solid 3rd place for me has to be Castlevania. It's a great challenge, and if you beat it, it honestly feels amazing seeing those credits roll as you think about what you just went through to get there. This is just the first in a 4-part series I'm doing on the 8-bit era of Castlevania games, so if you haven't already, hit subscribe to be notified of future releases here on the channel. Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest was released originally in 1987 in Japan for the Famicom Disk System. It was later ported to cartridge format for the NES in America and Europe and developed and published by Konami. Looking at the back of the box, I must say it gives better detail of what to expect compared to the previous game. Castlevania was a cakewalk compared to this bloody curse. Boy is that true. Like the previous game, there wasn't much information regarding storyline at the time, but now with how big the series is, I can give you a brief rundown of the plot. This game takes place 7 years after the first Castlevania. When you delivered the final blow to Dracula, you scattered 5 parts of his body across Transylvania. Upon doing this, during Dracula's final breath, he placed a curse on Simon that will slowly send him to an early grave. Simon must find all parts of Dracula to resurrect him to finally destroy him once and for all. Sure sounds epic, doesn't it? So let's check out the gameplay. Actually, did you know that this game garnered a bit of controversy when it was pictured on the front cover of the second issue of Nintendo Power? I think it's pretty cool actually. The figure depicting Simon Belmont holding Dracula's severed head? Come on, that's badass. I've always been a sucker for 80s and 90s death and thrash metal front album covers, and it's somewhat given me that kind of vibe. Apparently it was too much for some though, because Nintendo received many telephone complaints from parents who had purchased it for their kids. Also, did you know that most of the original artwork for Simon's Quest and other early Castlevania games got destroyed during the Great Hanshin earthquake in 1995? It was devastating. 6,434 lost their lives due to this. That's a bit of a downer, so I do apologise. How about this though? Did you know this was actually the first ever episode of the Angry Video Game Nerd I watched way back in 2006 when I was literally thinking I may be the only other person in the world who was going back to enjoy these older games? Great video, but I can promise none of my views on this game will be dictated by the views he shared in that. Right, I know, I'm delaying the inevitable here, so let's get into the game. Best way for me to probably open this is by saying this is completely different from the previous title. Simon controls the same, feels the same, whips the same, so what's the big deal then? It's open world and not linear like the first game. You're probably thinking, that sounds amazing, and I always thought that too until I actually played it. I'm going to run through a few key changing elements and give you my opinion on them, so strap yourselves in. First off, we are now exploring the whole of Transylvania rather than just Dracula's castle. With this, we aren't just handed a load of enemies to deal with on our way to take out the Count himself. We now have townspeople we can interact with who will give clues and sometimes just nonsense chit chat. Great idea, but the same people we have to speak to get these clues don't actually offer much help at all. Not all are as terrible as they are made out to be by most critics. Some actually offer some decent information, but the ones who are supposed to give you information to help you progress? Yeah, they're not that much help. This is why on my first playthrough I got to one section that I'll touch on later and then unfortunately had to rely on a guide to help me get through this game. Along with the townsfolk that give you little or no information, you also find people you can buy items off of. Some of these things can be upgrades or even essential items to help with progression. Unlike the previous game in this, you have the ability to fully upgrade your whip, but these do come at a cost. The hearts you collect in this aren't used as ammo for sub-weapons. Well, sometimes they are, but for the majority of the game, hearts are used as currency. Currency can be pretty tight at the start of the game, but once you find a decent place to farm for hearts, you'll be set for a while, as the more you progress, the less you have to worry about how much dough you're collecting, as this will come naturally. Along with merchants, it's within these towns you can heal up in the church. Just go in up the stairs, speak to the priest, and that's you back to full health. Game overs in this aren't really something you need to worry about. You're given 3 lives and once they are gone it's game over, but if you select continue you will resume from the exact same position in which you died, so there's no backtracking or anything. Only thing that may be a slight inconvenience is you'll lose all your hearts and XP. You'll keep all your upgrades and sub-weapons you have collected on your way up to this point though. Probably a good time to point out the game's day and night cycle. During your travels, after a certain amount of time, you'll be stopped in your tracks and greeted with this. And after some time, this again. These 2 bits of text indicate to the player if it's night or day. Now this is one element of the game I've seen being heavily criticised, but of course, like everything, it comes with its own pros and cons. Pros being when dealing with an enemy at night, they'll be a lot more tougher to deal with, but you'll receive more hearts. The size of the heart an enemy drops will determine how many they count for. For example, the small heart gives you 2 hearts and 1 XP, the half heart gives you 4 hearts and 3 XP, and the large heart gives you 6 hearts and 5 XP. More on experience points shortly though. During the night cycle, enemies will drop more higher given hearts, making farming for them less tedious. The cons to the day and night cycle though is that when it's night time, the towns you encounter are completely deserted and now overrun by zombies, meaning if you needed to buy something in said town or even heal up, you can't. Everything is shut, so you may just find yourself standing about waiting for the sunrise so you can progress, slowing the pace down completely. This actually impacts the ending of the game also. There are 3 endings to the game, and the ending you will receive all depends on how many days have passed in game. The longer you have said curse, the worse off you are at the end. I got the middle ending if that means anything to you. You're always against the clock when outside, but if you are inside a building, in a town or a mansion, time freezes so you don't have to worry about it. Now back to those experience points I mentioned there. This game implements some RPG elements by allowing the player to level up. As I said, it's the hearts you pick up from killing enemies that will give you XP. The maximum level you can get to is 6. Thankfully, you can't just farm in the same spot right from the beginning of the game to fully max yourself out. Each level is capped between the mansions you visit in the game, so once you hit a level for a certain area, easier enemies no longer give out XP. This is great because as the game progresses it does become more difficult, but it also means you're not overpowered, making the game a complete walk in the park. Leveling up comes with its usual traits. You have more health and become stronger, you know, the standard stuff when it comes to leveling up in a game. This game also features an inventory screen in the pause menu. Here you can keep track of the time, how many hearts you have, experience rating so you can keep track of how your leveling up is going, along with all your sub-weapons that you can equip and unequip depending on the situation where you need them or not. Now all these things I have just mentioned are nice additions giving the series a new take, but unfortunately this is overshadowed by the game's crypticness. As I previously mentioned, the townsfolk aren't that helpful. By no means as useless as they are made out to be by most critics, but the main issue is the game's translation of things that could and would be incredibly helpful to know to help with progression. As I said, I got to one section in the game before resorting to using a guide, and no, it's not the bit most people would expect. It was actually here in the first mansion. I had no idea what to do here. I had spoke to someone who said I should buy a crystal. Great, so I done that. Turns out I had to have it equipped to reveal a ledge that floats up and down. You'd think because it was one of the only few items I had it would be automatically equipped. Was it my own stupidity? You tell me. It really drove me up the wall though, having me backtracking all over the place to get some sort of clue, and after that, yes, I did feel like an idiot of course, but I soon realised without a map or guide I'd soon find myself wasting my own precious time when I really didn't need to. How about this guy who says, a flame is on top of the 6th tree in Dennis Woods? Nope. How about you try throwing holy water on some bricks in a cave to find it? Or how about, rumour has it the ferryman at Dead River loves garlic? Brilliant, now I know that I'll need garlic, but how would I know I was supposed to be in a graveyard and drop it on the floor for a man to appear to gift me an item? Don't get me started on the ferryman as well by the way. Without a guide, how would I know that I was supposed to equip an item then speak to him to get the boat moving? Also while on this subject, the boat travels to the left, so when I got back you'd expect me to be in the same place I originally started, right? Guess what happens if you stay on the boat and go back again? You end up in a completely new place. How on earth would I know to do that? Same with the section that looks like a dead end. How would I know to kneel here with a blue crystal to reveal a path ahead? How in hell would I know I need to equip the red crystal here and kneel for a tornado to appear to take me away? It's absolutely ridiculous. I hate having to use guides for games. Like, yeah, it's great I finally managed to complete this game, but I used a guide, so did I really complete it? Did I accomplish anything? By the time I finished the game, I actually had more questions than answers. The greatest bit of advice I got from anyone in this game was the person who told me to equip laurels so I don't take damage in the poisonous marsh. Cheers, mate. All crypticness aside now that I've finished venting, when we aren't dealing with ridiculous written dialogue on screen or trying to level up, your playing experience will feel exactly like the previous game. Classic side-scrolling action. Simon is just as handy as he was in the first entry. Still feels like a tank mind you, but doesn't get in the way at all. There's a whole heap of new enemy types and sub-weapons to get stuck in with here to keep the game feeling fresh. A few returners in this that you may recognise, but there's a whole cast of new ones, and just like the first game, they all have their own strengths and weaknesses. different patterns to figure out, some just come straight for you, while others may throw projectiles and even a few that do a combination of both. Enough variety here when it comes to enemies to stop the game getting old and repetitive. One aspect I really enjoyed was the ability to upgrade the whip throughout the game. You'll either meet these people in towns or out on your travels who will allow you to upgrade your whip at a cost. Thankfully, if you die, you will keep all upgrades you got on your travels. Same goes for sub-weapons too. There's a few that we didn't see in the first game, but the greatest sub-weapons I found to be the most helpful were actually the sub-weapons you receive while in mansions. The mansions is where I definitely felt at home the most while playing this. This is where I truly felt as if I was playing a Castlevania game. The only issue I had was the lack of bosses though. You see, there are 5 mansions you have to travel to. Once you reach the end, there is an orb you have to strike with a stake giving you one part of Dracula. These can be pretty helpful, like Dracula's rib that can be used as a shield to deflect projectiles. Dracula's eye can show you things hidden within walls, while Dracula's nail allows you to whip walls to break them instead of having to use holy water to do so. Problem is, you have to have them equipped to use them, so it's a bit trial and error at times. But yeah, one thing I loved about the previous game was the bosses that definitely gave me the most bother. Not to worry here though, look what happens during a boss. You can completely skip them if you want to. However, if you do decide to beat them, you will be rewarded with a powerful sub-weapon, but to be honest, if you're upgrading the whip, there's not really much use for the sub-weapons I found. Like I said, the one I got the most use out of was Dracula's rib, purely for the ability to deflect projectiles. The bosses are so easy to beat too, which I found disappointing. Like honestly, I did not struggle with a single one. Check out my encounter with Death. Remember the previous game where there was projectiles flying all over the place? Not an issue here, just spam him with the flame and you'll be stun locked, making this a complete walk in the park. Same with Dracula. I mean, how disappointing is this? For a final boss, it's incredibly underwhelming. In fact, the whole build up to finally getting to Dracula was disappointing. This is one thing I didn't touch on when covering the previous game, but the anticipation and atmosphere before meeting Dracula was well played. Not only was it a challenging experience to get there in the first place, but you know when you're about to encounter him. The music changes as you ascend the stairs to Dracula's lair. In this, its delivery is incredibly weak. Dracula's castle is completely dead. Like nothing around whatsoever, no enemies. All you have to do is get from point A to point B and you'll face him. I appreciate that this castle has its own unique theme, but it doesn't do anything for me at all. This could have been pulled off well if the theme was perhaps a bit on the unsettling or spooky side. A bit like the anticipation you feel in Zelda Ocarina of Time just before you encounter Ganondorf. That scary music getting louder and louder as you come closer to encountering him still sends shivers down my spine to this day. It just feels like one big wasted space in this though. Also, another issue with bosses, the music stays the same as it does in every mansion you encounter apart from Dracula. And even when you face Death or Camilla, they don't have a unique theme to their own like the previous game where the music would change when you get to a boss to give it its own unique intense atmosphere. I guess while we're on the subject of music, we may as well continue. I'm probably going to get some heat for this, but I wasn't the biggest fan of the music in this. I'm sure there's someone right now going absolutely berserk, and I'll say, keep crying son. I'm joking, so calm down. My opinion did change. The only issue I had was I was playing the PAL release and the music is incredibly slow in this version compared to the North American release. I didn't realise how slow they were in comparison until I was looking for songs to be placed behind my voiceover for this video. My favourite tune was the Nocturnal Curse Monster Dance. Just listen to the comparison. Same with Bloody Tears, which is now a very iconic song for the series. Like most of these Castlevania tunes, they will be remixed and reimagined throughout the years with later releases. Another aspect of this game I actually enjoyed was the platforming. I found it to be a lot more difficult in this than the previous game. There was a lot more thinking involved between jumps, especially this section here with the blocks raising up and down. For some reason though, I didn't encounter too many enemies in these areas, so I didn't get the dreaded knockbacks resulting in instant deaths like the previous game. But like I said, you'll always continue from where you died, so this wouldn't be a big deal anyway. The way I died the most in this was stupid things like holding my finger down in a direction when leaving the inside of a building and instantly falling down a hole, which is my own fault, so can't blame the game for my own stupidity, I guess. I'm not going to lie, I was left disappointed by this game. Yeah, there are some elements I like, but as a whole package it just didn't do it for me. The poor translation for the town people was a big issue. Like I said, sometimes they will tell you stuff that makes sense, but others not so much. Like the important stuff that will bring progression to a screeching halt. I did like the mansion sections, but the lack of bosses, or when there was bosses and them being too easy, just left me feeling very underwhelmed. Especially after getting it so right in the first title. I'd say by all means give it a bash. There may be something here you'll enjoy or see that I didn't, but I really don't enjoy playing games where, for me at least, a guide is needed. I'm really just left looking forward to playing Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse now, which will be my follow-up to this, so stay tuned because I have never played that one before. Oh boy, have I been looking forward to this one. Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse was originally released in Japan in December of 1989 and later released in Europe in December of 1992. That's some gap. As far as the story goes, this is actually a prequel to the original Castlevania and we get a decent rundown of what's going on from the title screen here. We're actually in control of Trevor Belmont for the first time. We find out that Dracula has been practicing sorcery to create a world full of evil and hatred. Dracula started taking over Europe, people tried to defend themselves but nobody survived. With the Belmont family having a history of fighting evil behind them, it only made sense for them to be summoned to rid them of Dracula's evil. With the Belmont family being as powerful as they are, it was only natural that the townspeople felt intimidated by them, but they managed to find one Belmont family member who could help, that being Trevor Belmont, the wielder of the vampire killer whip. Now that sounds great, let's check out the gameplay. The only way I could think of starting this review was by saying this game is the dog's bollocks. Now I know this is only the third game in the series, well 5th if you want to include Haunted Castle, which I don't, and Castlevania the Adventure for the Game Boy, which I will be covering shortly. It goes back to its roots here. If you like the first Castlevania then you will love this, which in a way makes it kind of difficult to do a review on, especially after just doing one on the first Castlevania. Don't worry though, there is enough added here to merit a video on its own and that's what I'm going to get into. Even though Simon Belmont and Trevor Belmont are different, Trevor plays and controls the exact same as Simon did in the previous two games on the NES. All those new sub-weapons that were in Simon's quest is gone. So it's back to the OG when it comes to sub-weapons. We once again see the likes of the stopwatch, holy cross, holy water, flying axe and the knife. The screen nuke is back as well, along with those books you can collect to throw more than one sub-weapon at a time. The difficulty has been ramped up big time in this one. I always knew this was considered tough, but I was not expecting it to be this bad. I got my arse handed to me on multiple occasions in this. I actually found myself using the sub-weapons a lot more in this, and a lot more tactically compared to the previous entries. Like I said in my Castlevania 1 video, my two favourite sub-weapons were the cross and stopwatch, but I found a lot more use for the other weapons in this too, which I think is great. Now they all have a good enough excuse to be used rather than just relying on one or two like I did in the first game. I will touch on different enemy types shortly, but for now let's take a look at some of the game's new features. I said we control Trevor Belmont, but we do also have 3 new playable characters we meet on our travels in this. The first one being Sypha, who is a priestess who disguised herself as an apprentice monk and uses the power of the elements. She had been dispatched on a secret mission to infiltrate Dracula's castle, but failed when she got captured by a Cyclops and turned into stone. We also have Grant Dynasty, who is a carefree rebel and a thief from the town of Wallachia. He had been plotting to overthrow Dracula, but he and his comrades were no match for his army. Last but not least, and now probably the most loved character in the Castlevania series who makes his debut here, and that is Alucard, the son of Count Dracula. He changed his name to Alucard as a sign that he opposed his father's way of life, and infiltrated the underground of Wallachia when Dracula dispatched his armies. Each have their own characteristics, some better than others I should say, at least with my experience anyway. Sypha is a mage who can cast spells, extremely overpowered. She has two different attacks, one being a fire spell that has a decent range and obliterates enemies who are in front of it. She also has a homing attack when used, it targets enemies on screen. Grant moves the quickest in the game but has an incredibly short range when it comes to his attacks. He can also climb onto walls, but I just could not come to grips with it at all, no pun intended. I just found it incredibly awkward to control, especially from being underneath, moving to the side, then up as you can see from the footage here. This cost me a few times. However, he does have one ability which I found the most useful, and that was how he could change direction mid-jump, which no others could do up to this point. You could say it's an absolute game changer because up to this point in previous games, all characters once committed to a jump, that's it. You better hope for the best. This made some sections a bit easier being able to adjust before committing to a jump. Alucard's attack is projectiles. He starts off with one, but much like Trevor, by collecting these weapon upgrades he soon has the ability to shoot 3 at one time. Much like Grant, I thought he was on the weaker side when it came to attacking. His saving grace though is the ability to turn into a bat. These come at the cost of hearts. 1 second in his bat form counts for 1 heart. This makes some sections an absolute joke, giving you the chance to skip large portions of some stages. With each character's own unique abilities, you can reach certain sections of stages that others can't, so it's a bit trial and error and you'll need a few playthroughs to see what's fully in every stage. Now I know this inclusion of multiple characters is heavily praised, but for me personally it didn't do much. And by no means taking anything away from the game. As a whole it's a solid classic, but when it comes to Castlevania titles, and most games to be honest, I just prefer playing as the one protagonist. Not to say I completely hate the idea, there was some sections where I hit a brick wall while playing as Trevor and then would swap to whatever character I had and found out they made a certain section a bit easier. I like how we are given a choice whether we want to use said characters or not. Like I said, I prefer the one protagonist, but I did do multiple playthroughs with each character for the sake of the video. One thing I did like about how you meet said characters is how you find them, so let's get into that. So the first game was completely linear while the second game took a non-linear approach. I like the idea of a non-linear game with Simon's Quest, but I think it was a bit too far ahead of its time and the execution wasn't that great. This game takes a little from the 2 previous games. Plays like the original, but there are multiple paths you can take on your travels. This is pulled off brilliantly in this, giving the game a whole load of replayability to it. This is how you meet the other side characters in the game depending on what path you take. This in a way is the game's difficulty setting, but doesn't make it too obvious to you. Each path definitely determines how difficult you want to make it for yourself. I've done a playthrough on Sypha and Grant's paths, but Alucard's I found to be extremely difficult. Like levels of frustration I haven't felt in a video game for a long time. Like I said, I prefer to use the one protagonist, and I like how we are given a choice whether to use them or not, but Alucard's path was the one path I found Trevor to be absolutely useless in. I feel as if some of the enemies you encounter on his path are fully designed to be used with Alucard in mind. These bone dragons are a nightmare with Trevor, but with Alucard, he makes light work of them. So yeah, the multiple paths are great and a good excuse to replay the game once completed. Also, just seeing what each level is like was enough incentive for me to do so because the game looks lovely. Each stage has its own unique feel and atmosphere, which made me look forward to what stages look like further on in the game while I was playing. There is definitely an upgrade when it came to the graphics, with certain stages having a certain kind of depth to them which the previous games didn't. I feel like this game really pushes the hardware for the NES. Mind you, it was only a year after this game's release in Japan that the well-loved Super Nintendo would be released. There's a load of new stage designs for the series here. We see the inclusion of vertical scrolling levels, set pieces like dodging blocks that fall from the sky to create a path leading upwards, new environmental hazards like jumping from one moving platform to another moving platform, a few here that would reappear in future Castlevania games. Continuing on with the enemies, there's a lot from the previous games, but we have some new ones too. I was pleasantly surprised to see some enemies from Super Castlevania 4, which I thought that's where they made their debut, but I was wrong. These are the Mudmen, Fishmen and Frogs, all great additions to the game. You'll find them all in the correct settings also, so they never really look out of place in the different environments you find yourself in. Much like everything else in this game, the boss fights have been ramped up big time also. There are 12 bosses in this game. At the earlier stages in the game they are fairly easy to take care of, but naturally the more you progress the more difficult they become. They throw in multiple bosses one after another in some stages. Hopefully by the next time you encounter them though you have memorised their pattern. One boss that completely threw me off guard though was the Bone Dragon King. I could tell by the time he disappeared that I didn't fully drain his health. I thought it was maybe a glitch, but my draw dropped once he reappeared again after I'd made further progress in that level. The two-headed dragon really gave me a lot of bother on my first run, but like most games, once you get the pattern down you'll feel a lot more at ease. The final encounter with Dracula is fantastic in this. In fact, the whole journey getting to him is great. You make your way through some parts taken right from the original Castlevania game before meeting him. He has three forms that you must deal with: his regular look, a floating head, then a massive beast that shoots projectiles. This kicked my arse for a while, but see, as soon as I defeated him I just felt a sigh of relief while watching those credits roll as I sat reflecting on my experience getting to the end. The bosses do really give you a run for your money in this, so you better be prepared if this is your first outing with this game. I guess that's maybe why the game allows for a feature that can give you extra lives. Simply type help me in the name select menu and you'll start with 10 lives rather than 2. A password for extra lives is great, but one thing I could have benefited from personally was more added time. This was actually my first experience with a Castlevania game where I felt as if I was against the clock. I faced so many bosses where the timer either reached 0 resulting in me dying or just narrowly defeating them in time. Never seen time as an obstacle in the first game, but here was a different story. I don't know if I was playing too tactically or what, but it's definitely something you best keep your eye on. Right, I've always said that the soundtrack for Super Castlevania 4 is some of the best music I've ever heard in a video game, but I was not expecting the music in this to be as good as it was. We are straight back to the roots with this one, with all stages having their own unique feel compared to the previous game that used the same song a lot for the same environments. I can honestly say I don't think there is a bad tune in this, which I hope you have been able to hear throughout this video with the backing music I've used from it. Then it hit me big time once I started doing a bit of research for this and heard that people actually dislike the soundtrack. Not the soundtrack as a whole though, just the ones released for the North American and PAL region, which had me intrigued. So I searched up the Japanese OST and holy hell, did they get the better end of the bargain or what? All is musically the same, but the original Japanese version contained a specialised sound chip, the Konami VRCVI. This chip added an extra 2 square waves and a sawtooth wave, which if you don't know what that means, let me show you. Here's a few of my favourite songs from this game and just hear the difference. Hopefully you'll be as gobsmacked as I was. First will be the North American and PAL version, and second will be Japanese. They just sound a lot more beefier with the added bass. I did play the PAL version of the game for the video, but hearing the difference in the sound alone for the game's music was enough for me to find a copy of the Japanese version just to experience this all again with a much better sounding original soundtrack. Like I said, if you enjoyed the first game then you'll definitely love this. I'd describe it as Castlevania 1 but on gear, dialed all the way up. All the new features like separate paths you can take, giving the game a whole load of replayability value, multiple characters to use, even though I wasn't the biggest fan of it, although they definitely had their uses for certain sections in the game. New set pieces like vertical scrolling levels, new enemy types, harder bosses with some even having 2 parts to the fight. The music is absolutely phenomenal too. It really is just the total package when it comes to Castlevania on the NES. Next up is the Castlevania games on the Game Boy, so stay tuned for that. As always, if you enjoyed, please consider subscribing to be kept up to date with future content. Also, if you liked the video, then please do so. If not, hit dislike. Either way, it lets me know what I'm doing right and what I'm doing wrong. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya!